In 1789, there was a sudden outbreak of smallpox in an area of Australia called Sydney by the British colonizers who had just settled there. Although the British themselves were unharmed, having previously been inoculated, the outbreak was utterly devastating to the Aboriginal Australians in the vicinity who had never encountered the disease before. Ever since the event happened, a debate has raged over how the smallpox virus came to Australia and how it found its way into the local Aboriginal population. One view, held even by some of the colonizers at the time, was that the virus came from the British themselves, and an extension of this view is the position that the virus was released deliberately by the British in order to murder the local Aboriginal people. The possibility of deliberate infection was even considered by some of the earliest British commentators on the event, and today it remains a strongly supported, though highly controversial position. What really happened in 1789? 1789 outbreak. In May 1789, Lieutenant General Watkin Tench, a British Marine, described in his journal the horrific results of an outbreak of smallpox in the newly settled region of Australia now called Sydney. In particular, he mentioned the death of an Aboriginal Australian man whom he called Arabanu, though we do not know his Aboriginal name, writing, quote, "From some imperfect marks and indents on his face, we were inclined to believe that he had passed this dreaded disorder. Even when the first symptoms of sickness seized him, we continued willing to hope that they proceeded from a different cause. But at length the disease burst forth with irresistible fury." End quote. Noteworthy in this account is the fact that Tench and the other settlers were initially uncertain as to what Arabanu was suffering from, though they eventually interpreted it as smallpox. Tench wrote of the great efforts made to save Arabanu's life, saying, quote, "It was superfluous to say that nothing which medical skill and unremitting attenuation could perform were left unexerted to mitigate his sufferings and prolong a life which humanity and affectionate concern towards his sick compatriots unfortunately shortened." End quote. At this point, we really need to contextualize this indisputably compassionate account by providing some more information about the situation. Arabanu was an Aboriginal man who had been literally kidnapped by the settlers on the command of Governor Arthur Phillip in an attempt to find a way of communicating better with the Aboriginal Australian people. In Phillip's own words, quote, "It was absolutely necessary that we should attain their language or teach them ours, that the means of address might be pointed out to them if they are injured, and to reconcile them by showing them many advantages they would enjoy by mixing with us." End quote. It seems Phillip did not realize that kidnapping someone and forcing them to become a translator was not the best way of showing them many advantages they would enjoy by mixing with us. Once the colonizers had concluded the virus was smallpox, they attempted to discover its origin. Australian historian Michael J. Bennett writes, quote, "There was complete bewilderment regarding the source of the disease," adding, quote, in a footnote added to his journal prior to publication, Watkin Tench observed that no solution to the problem of provenance, quote, "had been given when I left the colony in December 1791, end quote. Bennett further observes that as Tench continued to probe the problem of the virus origin, he eventually faced a troubling fact. The British colonizers had brought specimens of the virus with them in glass bottles. The logical conclusion that this was the source of the smallpox outbreak was so obvious and yet so troubling that Tench recoiled from it, writing, quote, "It is true that our surgeons brought out variolous matter in bottles, but to infer that it was produced from this cause were a supposition so wild as to be unworthy of consideration." End quote. The fact that Tench resisted this conclusion so strongly demonstrates clearly that he understood the ethical and moral implications. Once they became aware of the devastating effects of the outbreak on the local Aboriginal population, the British colonizers attempted to help. Bennett writes, quote, "The British officers saw an opportunity to conciliate the Aborigines," end quote, and quotes British Marine officer David Collins stating, quote, "The knowledge of our humanity and the benefits we might render them would, it was hoped, do away the evil impressions they had received of us," end quote. However well-meaning this gesture was, it was more than a little too late, given the repeated conflicts between the colonizers and the Aboriginal people up to this point, which had been initiated and exacerbated by British actions. The idea that the local Aboriginal people would become reconciled to the foreign settlers as a result of the provision of this medical care was not only wildly over-optimistic, but overlooked the fact that the outbreak was most likely inflicted by the settlers themselves in the first place. Scholarly discussion. Not only was a British origin of the smallpox virus suspected immediately after the event itself, but Australian social commentators, historians, and scholars have continued to argue over the cause for more than a century. Independent scholar Christopher Warren has arguably written the most on this subject, producing at least 5 articles and several other presentations from 2007 to 2016. Warren, who is a socialist with strong sympathy for the Aboriginal Australian people, has followed the discussion of the event through both primary sources and historical commentaries, as well as in the modern scholarly debate of the issue. Warren notes that in 1911, Surgeon Edward Charles Stirling suggested that the smallpox virus may have been introduced by visiting sailors from Southeast Asia. However, he notes this possibility was dismissed in 1914 by John Cumston, Director General of the Department of Health, who wrote, quote, "The safest course would seem to be to follow the generally accepted theory that the introduction of the disease amongst the Aborigines was in some way associated with the arrival in Australia of a comparatively large number of Europeans." End quote. It's important to note that already in 1914, Cumston was referring to a British origin of smallpox as, quote, "the generally accepted theory," end quote. Following the debate into the late 20th century, Warren cites Australian economic historian Noel Butlin and historian David Day, both of whom argued that the virus had originated with the settlers, and refers to scholars Judy Campbell, Charles Wilson, and Alan Frost, who objected, claiming the virus in the smallpox scabs brought by the settlers would not have been actively infectious by the time it reached Australia, having been damaged by environmental heat and humidity conditions aboard ship. According to Warren, very little original work was produced on the subject after 2000, with supporters of the two main views becoming entrenched in their positions, with the result that, quote, "the rigour of the literature degenerates," end quote. He adds that some confusion has been introduced into the literature, with historian John Connor, zoologist Tim Flannery, and historian Thomas Keneally making the uncertain claim that, in Warren's words, quote, "there was only a bottle of smallpox scabs and that it remained sealed or unbroken and secure on a shelf," end quote. Having reviewed the literature up to 2007, Warren comments, quote, "at this point the literature provides no resolution and various writers simply recycle past theories for alternative sources for the outbreak or support First Fleet responsibility, depending on their varying estimations of the relevance of the imported British supplies of smallpox," end quote. However, Warren himself has consistently made the claim that the smallpox outbreak was a deliberate act of biological warfare by the British colonizers, aimed at eliminating the local Aboriginal population, which was seen as a serious physical threat to settler expansion. Warren notes that at this time, quote, "flintlock muskets were not effective against Aboriginal weapons," end quote, citing inaccuracy at range, misfiring, slow reload times, and the increasing familiarity of the Aboriginal people with firearms, to which they were rapidly adapting. As a consequence, Warren argues, quote, "in all these circumstances, with no resupply and a dire need to expand the settlement, some Marines must have viewed their predicament, and therefore that of the settlement, as either untenable or on the verge of total calamity. At this point in time, the release of smallpox may well have occurred as an act of military necessity," end quote. Was it smallpox? As we have seen, the British settlers themselves were initially uncertain as to whether or not the disease they were seeing was smallpox, and the possibility that it was in fact a different virus has been raised several times in the literature. In 1987, legal historian Barry Wright asserted, quote, "it was not in fact smallpox at all which killed the Aborigines at that time," end quote, citing other diseases such as measles and chickenpox which could have presented similar physical symptoms while being equally deadly. Making the case for chickenpox, Wright asserted, quote, "though the records of the early white settlers would be sure to mention smallpox, they would hardly mention chickenpox. For white children it was a mild disease of childhood," end quote, adding, quote, "its effects to the European observers would be indistinguishable from smallpox," end quote, and citing the fact that there was no outbreak of smallpox among the Europeans. However, the view that the disease was indeed smallpox continued to be assumed in the literature. In 2009, Bennett cited primary sources identifying the disease as smallpox, writing, quote, "in his report on the epidemic, Governor Phillip expressed no doubt as to the identity of the disease," end quote, and adding, quote, "None of the surgeons has left accounts of the epidemic, but Phillips and King's categorical statements must surely reflect the considered opinion of Surgeon General White," end quote. Observing, quote, "The British authorities came to the conclusion that the disease was smallpox, and modern scholars have largely accepted their verdict," end quote, Bennett suggested, but could not prove, quote, "The British surgeons confirmed the diagnosis experimentally by variolation," end quote. In 2010, Dr. John Carmody, a physiologist at the University of Sydney, argued even more strongly against the certainty of the diagnosis. He noted the original identification of the disease as smallpox, quote, "came primarily from the journals of a few colonists, notably David Collins, the judge advocate, and Watkin Tench, neither of whom was a medical man," end quote. Carmody pointed out that, quote, "it was only in 1767, just under 20 years before the First Fleet left, that the eminent British physician, Dr. William Heberden, in a lecture to the Royal College of Physicians, first distinguished chickenpox from smallpox. Prior to that, chickenpox was simply considered a milder form of smallpox," end quote. He further argued that the British surgeons present at the outbreak of the virus, quote, "had been trained as apprentices under an earlier generation of naval surgeons, none of whom would have been aware of the proceedings of the learned and exclusivist College of Physicians," end quote, and consequently would have been unable to give a reliable diagnosis. In a master's thesis at the University of Sydney in 2010, Jeff Ford likewise opposed the diagnosis of smallpox, writing, quote, "In a project applying a specialist understanding of disease and epidemiology from my own previous professional life as a pathobiologist, I had verified that the smallpox was not smallpox, but was chickenpox, brought to the colony in a latent form, later known as shingles," end quote. Ford further asserted, quote, "In extensive research of historic records from the colony, I have identified a likely convict carrier and the means by which the chickenpox infection spread through the population," end quote. However, since this topic is only tangential to his thesis, he omitted any explanation of the evidence he examined and did not explain the process of reasoning by which he arrived at his conclusion. Since he omits any citation of this previous work, it is unclear whether or not it was ever published formally. In 2014, Warren addressed directly the claim that the disease had been chickenpox, noting that when smallpox broke out in New South Wales again in 1829, military surgeon John Mayer observed that Aboriginal people who already had what appeared to be smallpox scars were unaffected. Warren argued, quote, "No other disease but smallpox could have arrived with the First Fleet to generate this immunity. Mayer's report therefore demonstrates that the earlier outbreak was true smallpox," end quote. However, in a comment on Warren's presentation, Carmody responded that Mayer, quote, "cannot retrospectively have made this diagnosis definitively, whether or not the disease was smallpox, chickenpox, or something else," end quote. Carmody argued that the scarring observed was not necessarily the product of previous smallpox infection, asserting that regardless of how the scars had originally been caused, quote, "there would have been a great deal of bacterial infection of the skin lesions, which would have worsened the scarring," end quote. Consequently, the scars could have been from another source and only looked like smallpox scars as a result of bacterial infection enlarging the scars. In his response, Carmody again noted, quote, "The only documentation which we have, at least as far as I know, is from two non-medical journal writers of whom Watkin Tench was more cautious, like the smallpox," he wrote, end quote, and again cited the fact that chickenpox could only have been differentiated from smallpox so recently that the surgeons in Australia at the time would have been unable to diagnose smallpox reliably. Macassan theory. In 1912, Australian microbiologist John Cleland suggested that the 1789 outbreak had been caused by smallpox introduced by foreign fishermen of the Macassan people in Indonesia, known as Macassans. Warren notes this theory became sufficiently popular to be printed in the Australian Encyclopedia of 1968 before it was challenged seriously in 1985 by Butland, cited previously. Macassans gathered sea cucumbers, known as trepangs, for the Chinese medicine market, fishing in the waters between Indonesia and Australia. They regularly visited Australia, and Butland himself acknowledged they experienced smallpox outbreaks and could carry it from Indonesia to Australia. However, the Macassans' landing sites in Australia were all located in the far north, ranging from the Northern Territory across to Upper Queensland, literally thousands of kilometres away from Sydney Cove, where the smallpox outbreak took place. Despite attempts to argue that the smallpox virus could have been transmitted via Aboriginal trade routes within Australia, since the Macassans were known to have trade and personal contact with the Aboriginal people, Butlin and other scholars objected that the highly virulent nature of smallpox would have required its preservation within a significant population density in order to spread over 4,000 kilometres from northern Australia to the southeast coast of New South Wales. Aboriginal communities had low population density, sometimes as few as 40 people, and an outbreak of smallpox within a previously unexposed community of this size would have either completely wiped it out or at least depopulated it to the extent that it would have been unable to maintain economic relations with other groups. Additionally, the transmission of smallpox over such a distance would have left a very clear and evident trail of destruction in the form of hundreds of casualties. Yet there is no firm evidence for smallpox outbreaks in northern Queensland until at least the 1820s, a good 30 years after the 1789 outbreak. Consequently, in 1985, Butlin concluded, quote, "I am left with my evaluation that as matters stand, a Macassan explanation seems beyond the limits of reasonable probability," end quote. Adding, quote, "The evaluations in the other sections of this article seem to me to work further towards a white explanation in the 1789 case," end quote. In 2002, scholar Judith Campbell sought to revive the Macassan theory using epidemiological studies relying on historical data from settler records. According to Campbell, quote, "Butlin underestimated the connection McKnight had made between Macassan visitors to northern Australia and introductions of smallpox. Nor did he recognise that smallpox spread through Indigenous communication networks," end quote. However, Campbell's own model came under critical scrutiny immediately. In a review of her work, the same year in which it was published, Australian historian Lorenzo Veracini objected to Campbell's over-reliance on historical sources of questionable accuracy. Although he recognised Campbell's attempt to place discussion of the topic on a more scientific basis through her use of epidemiology, Veracini asserted, quote, "Even if up-to-date epidemiological models were applicable, reproducing a very selected and uncritical collection of historical sources flaws Campbell's analysis," end quote, and concluded, quote, "In the end, while contributing meaningfully to the study of old world diseases and Aboriginals, Invisible Invaders," Campbell's book, fails in its ultimate attempt to excuse European responsibility," end quote. 6 years later, Australian historian Craig Meir returned to the Macassan theory and critiqued it further, providing evidence that Campbell had been wrong to claim that the smallpox scabs brought by the British settlers would have been rendered inactive by environmental conditions either on board ship during the voyage or in Australia subsequent to arrival, and providing multiple arguments against Campbell's claim that the smallpox virus could have been transmitted several thousand kilometres from northern Australia to Sydney Cove via transmission through Aboriginal trade routes. He concluded, quote, "There is no proof that smallpox was deliberately released by the British in Sydney, but, uncomfortable as it is to modern Australians, it is clear from the evidence that the idea that it was introduced by Macassan fishermen in the Northern Territory and travelled to Sydney at just the time the British arrived is untenable," end quote. Adding, quote, "Somehow the British brought smallpox with them on the first fleet, and it was released into the Aboriginal community in 1789 to wreak havoc and begin the destruction of Aboriginal societies in Australia," end quote. Similarly, in 2009, Bennett critiqued the Macassan theory, concluding, quote, "On closer examination, however, the case for a chain of infection from the Indonesian archipelago to Sydney Cove remains weak," end quote. Observing, quote, "In contrast to the situation in North America, there is no early evidence of smallpox along the path that the disease would have had to take," end quote. He added that British observers of the Sydney Cove outbreak record no evidence that the disease was travelling south. In contrast, Bennett notes, quote, "One of them reported that in response to the epidemic, the Aborigines fled to the northward," end quote. Despite these thorough critiques, the Macassan transmission theory was raised again in 2011 by Australian historian Campbell McKnight. In a paper focused primarily on the socio-economic impact of the Macassans in Australian history, McKnight also took the opportunity to comment on the Macassans as a vector for smallpox. Writing, quote, "There can be no serious doubt that the several epidemics in the 19th century began in northern Australia and spread southward," end quote. He noted, quote, "There is no difficulty in sourcing the infection back to Macassar. Indeed, Robert Brown, with Flinders, noted traces of smallpox among the men he met in 1803. End quote. However, McKnight made no independent effort to assess the practicality of smallpox transmission over the vast distance from northern Australia to Sydney Cove, apparently relying on Campbell's previous epidemiological study and theorised transmission route, and asserting, quote, the overwhelming probability must be that it was introduced, like the later epidemics, by trepangers on the north coast and spread across the continent to arrive in Sydney quite independently of the new settlement there, end quote, making this conclusion without further analysis. According to McKnight, quote, if about 1780 the trepang industry brought large numbers of men from the archipelago to Arnhem Land for the first time, the date of the epidemic's arrival in Sydney, with its terrible effects on a relatively dense but entirely virgin population, makes a great deal of sense. End quote. Nevertheless, this was a hypothetical for which McKnight himself provided no independent evidence. In 2014, Warren responded to McKnight, commenting, quote, these claims are excessive and do not take into consideration the scholarship since 2002, end quote. While acknowledging the evidence for smallpox among Macassans in northern Australia in 1803, Warren pointed out the lack of evidence for smallpox in the region any time earlier, and argued that even the 1803 smallpox occurrences, quote, cannot be associated with the outbreak near Sydney, as such scarring may have resulted either from the outbreak at Macassan in 1789 or from later outbreaks throughout Southeast Asia, end quote. As other scholars had done, Warren noted the lack of any evidence for a viable route of smallpox transmission from northern Australia to Sydney Cove, pointing out, quote, the main bartering and exchange routes from northern Australia mapped by McCarthy and Dale Kerwin do not include coastal New South Wales, and therefore do not support any spread of smallpox via such networks to reach Port Jackson, end quote. Convict theory. As mentioned previously, in 2009, Bennett suggested that convicts among the settlers could have used the smallpox scabs brought on board ship to infect the local Aboriginal population in retaliation for attacks. This view was apparently held by some earlier commentators, though I have been unable to identify any with certainty. Bennett wrote, quote, the smallpox matter was not government property and it could have been stolen or, more likely, discarded without any record, end quote. He added that since knowledge of how to use these scabs to inoculate against smallpox was general knowledge, quote, many British convicts would have been familiar with the use of scabs in variolation, and one or more of them may have seen in the smallpox matter an opportunity to seek revenge, end quote. Warren notes this proposal has some credibility, quote, particularly as a First Fleet convict, John Irving, had a medical background and probably had access to medical supplies, end quote. He also acknowledges conflict between convicts and Aboriginal people, as well as convicts seeking revenge for the killing of their fellow convicts, but notes that they did so, quote, by rather simple and direct means, end quote, through physical attacks. Warren observes that the outbreak seems to have started on the far side of Sydney Harbour and spread quickly on the north shore. This was quite distant from Sydney Cove, where the European settlement was located. Since the North Shore was typically accessed by boat due to its distance from the main settlement, Warren believes, quote, boats were used for smallpox deployment, end quote. This leads him to the further conclusion that neither convicts or anyone else could have been involved unless they had received authorization from one of the colony leaders, since, quote, from the 1st of June 1788, boats were not allowed out of Sydney Cove, and any Marines leaving the cove without leave were court-martialed and punished, end quote. British Marines theory. Probably the most widespread view is that the outbreak was caused deliberately by British Marines, whether acting independently or under authorization from superiors, aimed at eliminating the physical threat represented by the local Aboriginal community. Bennett stated, quote, the depopulation and the disruption and demoralization that followed in its wake tipped the balance of power decisively in favour of the colonists. The disease likewise brought some Aborigines into dependency, end quote. Without identifying precisely who was involved, Bennett's conclusion was, quote, if the imported matter was the source of the epidemic, it was probably communicated deliberately, end quote. Warren takes this position, arguing more specifically, quote, Deployment may have been a private act by senior Marines, possibly with assistance from a convict with access to medical supplies, or, more likely, a surgeon, end quote. In his view, the British Marines used smallpox deliberately as a biological weapon against the Aboriginal population out of fear of being overrun by attack, given the fact that the settlement was running low on supplies and ammunition. Warren writes, quote, "Given their dire predicament, the Marines may have considered they had no choice than to send smallpox into the camps of their adversaries. If the fleet had been supplied with sufficient military force and all necessary equipment, smallpox may never have been released." End quote. Warren notes that smallpox had been weaponized in North America earlier in the 18th century, and that this strategy, quote, "was promoted in a military tract of the period, Major Robert Donkin's Military Collections and Remarks, 1777, end quote, further observing that since Donkin served in various locations with the British Marines, he may have met with some of the Marines who ended up in Sydney Cove. In his 2007 paper, Could First Fleet Smallpox Infect Aborigines?, a note, Warren addressed comprehensively all of the arguments which had previously been made to support the view that the smallpox scabs brought by the British settlers would have been rendered inactive by environmental conditions, either on the voyage or shortly after arrival in Australia, citing, quote, "Wolf and Kroon's data, historical anecdotes concerning smallpox longevity in the environment, the temperature records of first fleeters, insights from contemporary medical practices, and WHO statements on the infectiousness of smallpox," end quote, to demonstrate that such arguments relied on incomplete data, poor data, misinterpretation of data, or failure to take into account the measures which settlers would have used to ensure the scabs were viable en route to Australia. As cited previously, Warren argued, quote, "We can be confident that the spread of smallpox was authorised by senior officials because it occurred on the opposite side of the harbour from the settlement," end quote. Adding, quote, "This indicates that boats were used for smallpox deployment, which would have required official planning and sanction because any Marines leaving Sydney Cove without permission were court-martialed," end quote. Conclusion. The effects of the outbreak were absolutely devastating on the local Aboriginal population. While casualty numbers vary widely from 750 to 2,600, there is no doubt that the fatality rate was likely as high as 50%, causing immense loss of life and terrible suffering. But what was the cause? The view held by White and Carmody that the outbreak was not smallpox but a different disease, such as chickenpox, seems to receive only marginal support among scholars discussing the issue, despite circumstantial evidence in favour of it. The theory of smallpox being introduced by Macassan fishermen has been substantially dismantled by Butlin, Veracini, Bennett and Warren. The convict theory, as articulated by Bennett, has been critiqued by Warren, though in substance it is hardly different to his own view, since it still attributes the outbreak to deliberate settler action and requires the same mechanism of authorization by settler officials. However, Warren's critique of the convict theory that, quote, "From the 1st of June 1788, boats were not allowed out of Sydney Cove, and any Marines leaving the Cove without leave were court-martialed and punished," end quote, weakens the case for his own view that the outbreak was commanded by the settlement's leadership. Although Warren claims, quote, "Any release could have occurred only if senior officials authorised it, senior enough to have authority to take boats out of Sydney Cove or Marines to Botany Bay," end quote, he nevertheless acknowledges, quote, "Any group of settlers able to take boats out of Sydney Cove could have deployed smallpox, including any informal group of senior Marines, without being noticed by Tench, Collins or Phillip," end quote. He thus fails to address the fact that a boat may have been authorised by a senior official who was ignorant of the real plans of those in the boat, and he also fails to address the possibility of a boat having been taken out of Sydney Cove without the knowledge of the authorities at all. Additionally, since Warren's theory relies on formal authorization of a boat's departure from Sydney Cove, he is left with the challenge of locating a record of such authorization. But he knows there is no such record. This fact has been raised by German historian Norbert Finz, who observed in 2008, quote, "There is, however, no written evidence of an order by a British officer to open the toxic bottle and spread the material contained therein, among the indigenous population, end quote. Although Warren has produced at least 5 articles or presentations on the smallpox outbreak from 2007 to 2016, I have not seen him ever address the absence of any record of the authorization on which his own proposal depends. However, in 2021, it was addressed by Finns, who believes the settlers had sufficient motive and opportunity to release the virus deliberately, and argued, quote, "It was only logical to assume that the British detachment had deliberately triggered the smallpox epidemic of 1789 to 90 to destroy and or weaken the unruly indigenous population of Australia in such a way that they would no longer resist a spread of white settlements in the south of the country," end quote. Finch deals with the lack of any evidence for authorization of either the virus release or a boat trip across Sydney Harbour, which could have been used to transmit the virus to the Aboriginal population, with the proposal that, quote, "Since the British in Australia were not officially in a state of war with the Aboriginal Australians," end quote, and since the settlers were under strict instructions from the British King George, quote, "to show themselves friendly and accommodating towards the natives," end quote, they would never have left such a record because, quote, "a written order or note to the contrary in the diary of an officer stationed in Australia could easily have been interpreted as a royal instruction violation," end quote. This is highly counterintuitive since, as Warren notes, by 1789 the settlers had already been in conflict with the local Aboriginal communities on a number of occasions, killing a number of them and kidnapping at least one of them, and they had recorded their aggressive actions in a variety of ways, in both official reports and records, as well as personal correspondence. In fact, as we have already seen, the kidnapping of the Aboriginal man called Arabanu was undertaken specifically as an attempt to address the settlers' conflict with the local Aboriginal population, and this was communicated directly by Governor Phillip to the Secretary of State. Theories of a deliberate use of smallpox by the settler leadership to decimate the local Aboriginal community thus face several challenges. The first is that the settlers themselves seemed initially unaware of what was causing the sickness. Watkin Tench wrote that when their captive Arabanu appeared to be showing the signs of smallpox, quote, "we continued willing to hope that they proceeded from a different cause," end quote. Bennett acknowledges, quote, "there was complete bewilderment regarding the source of the disease," end quote, citing Tench writing that, quote, "no solution to the problem of provenance had been given when I left the colony in December 1791, end quote. The second is the fact that when the outbreak became known to the settlers, official steps were taken in an attempt to save the lives of the afflicted Aboriginal people, placing them in medical care near the settlement hospital. In fact, Marine Officer David Collins wrote that this was done specifically because the settlers hoped it would, quote, "do away the evil impressions they had received of us," end quote. The third is the fact that there is no record or any other evidence, direct or indirect, of either an official command or authorization to use smallpox against the Aboriginal people, or of the boat trip which Warren asserts would have been necessary to transmit the virus to them. Finally, although this is only circumstantial, there is no evidence of smallpox ever being weaponized by the settlers again. Finch responds to this by claiming that, quote, "once the bridgehead in Sydney was secured and the Aboriginal Australians ceased to constitute a military threat, the British colonial officers could resort to normal military tactics," end quote, adding, quote, "with the emergence of a militarily and politically secured rule over a rapidly growing group of settlers, biological warfare became superfluous, especially since smallpox regularly reappeared within the indigenous populations of the 19th century," end quote. In the final analysis, it seems clear enough that the virus outbreak was smallpox, and it did emerge from the British settlement. However, the lack of a clear line of evidence for any specific series of events by which the settlers transmitted the virus to the local Aboriginal people makes it difficult to determine precisely how it happened. If there was a deliberate release, then it is clear that all of the people involved either deliberately left no record or destroyed their records and never spoke about it to anybody who could provide information on the incident to others. This makes the deliberate release theory unfalsifiable, though not impossible. Nevertheless, it must be remembered that even without conclusive evidence for a deliberate attack, the settlers still bear full responsibility for the outbreak and its consequences.